In the shadows of New York's glittering skyline, a $350 act of kindness unleashes a tsunami of buried secrets. Millionaire Richard Lawson's perfect life shatters when he discovers the beggar he helped is his own daughter, a child his beloved late wife never told him about. But that's just the beginning. As layers of deceit peel away, Richard uncovers a web of lies spanning 2 decades, a best friend's betrayal, a lover's ultimate sacrifice, and a truth so devastating it threatens to destroy everything he thought he knew about love, family, and himself. Now, with a grandson he never knew he had and a past he can't escape, Richard must navigate a minefield of emotions and impossible choices. Can he forgive the unforgivable, or will the ghosts of his past condemn him to a future of regret? Brace yourself for a heart-wrenching tale of shocking revelations, raw emotions, and the ultimate test of unconditional love. This isn't just a story of family secrets. It's a battle for redemption that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the power of forgiveness. The rain poured down on New York City, droplets sliding down the glass like tears, perfectly mirroring the emptiness inside Richard Lawson. He sat at a table in one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, surrounded by luxury that meant nothing to him. The world outside was grey and dreary, a fitting backdrop to the loneliness that had become his constant companion. It had been this way for over 2 decades, ever since his wife Emily had died tragically. Her death had left a hole that no amount of money or success could fill. Richard had built a financial empire, yet his victories felt hollow. He went through the motions, attending business meetings and lavish dinners, but everything was just a distraction from the pain he carried with him every single day. Richard absent-mindedly swirled the wine in his glass, watching the liquid spin in circles. The truth was, despite all his success, Richard was utterly alone. He had no children, at least none that he knew of. Emily had never wanted to discuss the idea of kids before she passed, and Richard hadn't pushed her on it. Now he regretted it deeply. What he wouldn't give to have a piece of her still alive, something of her to protect and love. He paid the bill and stood up, slipping into his wool coat. The restaurant was buzzing with conversations and laughter, but to him it was just noise, as distant as if it were happening in another world. He walked out onto the wet sidewalk, where the rain continued to fall, cold and relentless. The city pulsed with life around him, but Richard felt nothing but the chill of the rain and the weight of his own solitude. The walk home took him past places that he and Emily used to visit together. Every corner, every building seemed tied to a memory of a time when life had seemed so much simpler, so much happier. But now, all that remained were ghosts and a headstone. Tomorrow, like most days, he would visit Emily's grave. Père Lachaise in Paris would have been the natural place for her to rest, but for reasons Richard never fully understood, she had chosen New York. Maybe it was because the city represented the new life they'd started together, a life that had been cut short too soon. As he walked along the rain-soaked sidewalk, something caught his eye. Under the awning of a shop, a young woman sat huddled, clutching a baby in her arms. Her hair was damp from the rain, making her look even more fragile. The sight tugged at something deep within Richard. He paused, unsure of what to do. He wasn't the kind of man to get involved in situations like this. Over the years, he'd made countless donations to charities, but dealing with someone in need face-to-face wasn't something he was used to. Yet, there was something about this young woman that made him stop. Maybe it was the way she held the baby so carefully, with a tenderness that reminded him of someone or something. Richard approached slowly, the rain dripping from his coat. "Here," he said, pulling out $350 in cash he'd just withdrawn from an ATM. He handed it to her. "Use this to get some food for you and your baby." The woman looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise, then filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaky. "Thank you so much." For a moment, Richard felt something stir inside him, a connection to this stranger, as if their pain was somehow shared. He didn't say anything more, just nodded and walked away. But as he continued down the street, he couldn't stop thinking about what he had just witnessed. It was as if something had awakened inside him, something he hadn't realized was still there. When he finally got home, Richard was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. He lay down in bed, the sound of the rain tapping against the window his only companion. He closed his eyes, but the image of the woman and her baby kept replaying in his mind. Tomorrow, like always, he would visit Emily's grave. Little did he know that routine visit was about to change his life forever. The next morning, Richard followed his usual routine. He woke early, dressed in his typical tailored suit, and prepared for his visit to Emily's grave. The grey sky outside his window matched his mood perfectly, and the city was still wet from the rainstorm that had drenched it the night before. He grabbed his coat and headed out, the familiar heaviness settling into his chest as he prepared for yet another somber visit to the cemetery. As Richard made his way to the cemetery, his mind wandered back to the young woman and her baby. He couldn't understand why the image of them lingered in his thoughts. Over the years, he had seen countless people in need, but something about that encounter had stuck with him. There had been a look in the young woman's eyes, a mix of desperation and something deeper, something that he couldn't quite place. It unsettled him. Arriving at the cemetery, Richard took the familiar path toward Emily's grave. The place was quiet, the only sounds being the occasional rustle of wind through the trees and the distant hum of the city. He knew this place well, too well. Each visit was the same. He would stand in front of her headstone, talk to her as if she were still there, then leave feeling the same emptiness he had felt since the day she died. But today was different. As he approached the grave, Richard noticed something unusual. There was someone there, someone kneeling in front of Emily's headstone. His heart skipped a beat. It was the same young woman from the night before, her baby cradled in her arms. She was hunched over, her shoulders shaking as if she were crying. Richard stopped in his tracks, his mind racing. What was she doing here? How could she possibly know about Emily? The coincidence was too strange, too unsettling. He felt a wave of confusion and unease wash over him as he cautiously approached her. "Excuse me," Richard said, his voice low and uncertain. The woman looked up, startled. Her eyes were red and puffy, and she quickly wiped her face with the sleeve of her worn jacket. "I'm sorry," she mumbled, trying to compose herself. "I didn't mean to intrude." Richard shook his head, still trying to process what he was seeing. "You were here yesterday," he said slowly, "outside the restaurant. I gave you money." The woman nodded, glancing down at the baby in her arms, as if the connection between them was enough of an explanation. But for Richard, it wasn't. He needed to understand what was happening, why this woman, this stranger, was at his wife's grave. "What are you doing here?" Richard asked, his voice firmer now. "How do you know Emily?" For a moment, the woman hesitated, as if she were deciding whether or not to answer. Then, with a deep breath, she looked up at him, her eyes filled with a strange mix of pain and resolve. "Emily," she said softly. "She was my mother." Richard felt the ground shift beneath him, his breath caught in his throat. For a moment he thought he might have misheard her. He stared at the woman in disbelief, his mind struggling to catch up with what she had just said. "Your mother?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's impossible. Emily, she never had a child." The woman shook her head, her expression unreadable. "She did," she said quietly. "She had me. She just never told you." Richard felt like the world had come to a standstill. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of her words, but nothing added up. Emily couldn't have had a child, she would have told him. She wouldn't have kept something like that from him, or would she? He took a step back, the weight of the revelation crashing down on him. "No," he muttered, more to himself than to her, "and that can't be right. There's no way." "I know this is hard to believe," the woman said, her voice soft but steady, "but it's the truth. My name is Sophie, and Emily was my mother." Richard's chest tightened as the reality of her words began to sink in. He looked at the woman, Sophie, and then at the baby in her arms. His mind raced with questions, but he didn't know where to begin. "Why?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why would she keep this from me?" Sophie looked down at the ground, her expression filled with sadness. "I don't know," she admitted. "I never knew her. She died before I could meet her. I was raised by another family." Richard's heart pounded in his chest. He had spent more than 2 decades mourning the loss of his wife, believing he had known everything about her. And now, out of nowhere, he was faced with the possibility that she had kept a secret so profound it changed everything. A secret that had been buried with her for all these years. He took a deep breath, his mind reeling. "I don't understand," he said, shaking his head. "Why now? Why were you here?" Sophie's eyes met his, and for the first time, Richard saw something familiar in them, a glimmer of Emily. "I found out about her a few months ago," she explained. "I've been trying to piece together the truth ever since, and when I found out where she was buried, I had to come." Richard stared at her, still struggling to process everything. His emotions were a whirlwind of confusion, disbelief, and anger, but underneath it all, there was something else, a spark of hope. Hope that somehow, this connection to Emily hadn't been lost after all. He glanced down at the baby in Sophie's arms, and something inside him shifted. If Sophie was telling the truth, if Emily really had been her mother, then this child was his grandchild, a part of Emily that still existed in the world. I need to sit down," Richard said, his voice shaky. He moved to a nearby bench, his legs feeling weak beneath him. Sophie followed, sitting beside him with the baby still cradled in her arms. For a long moment they sat in silence, the weight of the revelation hanging heavy between them. Richard's mind was a storm of questions, each one bringing with it a new wave of emotion. "Tell me everything," he finally said, turning to look at Sophie. "I need to know, I need to understand." Sophie nodded, taking a deep breath before she began. "I was born in 1995, she started, her voice quiet but clear. "Emily gave me up for adoption right after I was born. I grew up not knowing anything about her or you." Richard's heart clenched at the mention of the year, 1995. He and Emily had been married for just 2 years then. How could she have hidden a pregnancy from him? How could he not have noticed? "A few months ago I started looking into my birth parents," Sophie continued. "It took a while, but I finally found out who Emily was. And then I found out about you." Richard listened, his mind still struggling to reconcile this new reality with the life he thought he had known. "But why?" he asked, the question that had been burning inside him since Sophie first spoke. "Why would Emily keep this from me? Why would she give you up?" Sophie shook her head, her eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored Richard's own. "I wish I knew," she said softly. "I've been asking myself the same question ever since I found out. But I think she must have had her reasons." Richard stood up abruptly, unable to sit still any longer. He paced in front of the bench, his mind racing. "Reasons," he said, his voice rising. "What reasons could possibly justify keeping a child secret, giving up her own daughter?" Sophie watched him, her expression a mixture of sympathy and caution. "I don't know," she said. "But I do know that it couldn't have been an easy decision for her. And I think she must have loved you very much to keep this from you." Richard stopped in his tracks, turning to look at Sophie. "Loved me," he said, his voice breaking. "If she loved me, how could she lie to me like this? How could she keep something so important from me?" As the words left his mouth, Richard felt a wave of guilt wash over him. Here he was, shouting about Emily's betrayal in front of the daughter she had given up, a daughter who had never known her mother. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice softer now. It's a lot to take in." Sophie nodded, her eyes understanding. "I know," she said. "Believe me, I've been trying to process it all for months now. But I thought you deserved to know the truth." Richard sat back down on the bench, feeling suddenly exhausted. He looked at Sophie, really looked at her for the first time since she had dropped this bombshell. He could see Emily in her now, in the curve of her chin, the shape of her eyes. How had he not noticed it before? "The baby," he said, gesturing to the child in Sophie's arms. Is this my grandchild?" Sophie smiled softly, looking down at the baby. "Yes," she said. "This is Daniel. He's 6 months old." Richard felt his breath catch in his throat. A grandchild. He had a grandchild. The idea was so foreign, so unexpected, that he didn't know how to process it. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to do with all of this." Sophie reached out hesitantly, placing a hand on Richard's arm. "You don't have to do anything right now," she said gently. "I know this is a shock. I thought you should know. About me, about Daniel, about the family you didn't know you had." Family. The word echoed in Richard's mind. For so long he had been alone, believing that any chance of family had died with Emily. And now, here was Sophie, offering him a connection he had never expected. "I need time," Richard said, his voice rough with emotion, "to think, to process all of this. But I'd like to know more. About you, about Daniel. If that's okay." Sophie nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I'd like that," she said. "We have a lot of catching up to do." As they sat there, in the shadow of Emily's grave, Richard felt something shift inside him. The world he had known for the past 2 decades had been turned upside down, but in its place, a new possibility was emerging. A chance to reclaim a piece of the life he thought he had lost forever. He didn't know what the future held, how this revelation would change things. But for the first time in years, Richard felt a glimmer of hope. A hope that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he had thought. As Richard sat on the bench next to Sophie, his mind still reeling from the revelation, he felt an overwhelming need to understand more. "Sophie," he began, his voice steadier now. "I need to know everything. About Emily, about you, about why she kept this secret. Do you have any more information?" Sophie nodded, reaching into her bag. "I found this when I was going through some of my adoption papers," she said, pulling out a worn journal. "It was my mother's, Emily's. I think you should read it." Richard's hands trembled as he took the journal. It was familiar. He recognized Emily's handwriting on the cover. How had he never seen this before? He opened it, his heart pounding as he began to read. The entries started just before their marriage, full of hope and love, but as Richard read on, he noticed a shift. Emily wrote of fears and doubts, of feeling trapped by expectations. And then, in an entry dated a few months before Sophie's birth, he found the truth he'd been seeking. "I can't tell Richard," Emily had written. "He's so focused on his career, on our future. Baby would change everything. I love him too much to burden him with this. I have to protect him, even if it means giving up our child." Richard's vision blurred with tears. He looked up at Sophie, who was watching him with a mix of apprehension and sympathy. "She thought she was protecting me," he said, his voice hoarse. "But she was wrong. I would have wanted to know. I would have wanted you." As they sat there, Richard continuing to read through the journal, a new figure approached. Richard looked up, his eyes widening in recognition. "James," he said, surprise evident in his voice. James Porter, Richard's old friend from his younger days, stood before them, looking uncomfortable. "Richard," he said, nodding. I saw you from across the cemetery. I didn't expect to see you here." Richard's mind raced. James and Emily had been friends too, back in the day. Could he have known about Sophie? "James," Richard said slowly, "did you know about this? About Emily's child?" James's face paled, and Richard knew the answer before he spoke. "Ah, yes," James admitted. "Emily told me when she found out she was pregnant. I tried to convince her to tell you, but she was adamant." Anger flared in Richard's chest. "You knew all this time, and you never said anything." James held up his hands defensively. "It wasn't my secret to tell, Richard. I promised Emily I wouldn't say anything." Richard stood up, his fists clenched. "She was my wife, James. You were my friend. How could you keep this from me?" Sophie intervened, placing a hand on Richard's arm. "Please," she said softly. "Let's not fight. Not here." Richard took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. He turned back to James. "I need to know everything," he said. "No more secrets." James nodded, looking relieved at the chance to explain. "Emily came to me when she found out she was pregnant," he began. "She was scared, Richard. Scared of how it would change your life. Scared of disappointing you." As James spoke, Richard felt his anger giving way to a deep, aching sadness. He had never known Emily had felt this way, had never realized she was carrying such a burden. "There's more," James said hesitantly. "Emily and we had a brief relationship before you two got together. It didn't last long, but when she found out she was pregnant, she wasn't sure. She wasn't sure who the father was." Richard felt like he'd been punched in the gut. He staggered back, sitting heavily on the bench. Sophie gasped beside him, her hand flying to her mouth. "What are you saying?" Richard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. James looked pained. "Emily did a paternity test, Richard. That's why she was so sure about giving Sophie up for adoption. She didn't want to risk ruining your marriage if the baby turned out to be mine." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Richard's mind was a whirlwind of emotions: betrayal, anger, confusion, grief. He looked at Sophie, seeing her in a new light. Could she be James's daughter, not his? "I need to know," Richard said, his voice shaking. "I need to know for sure." Sophie nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "We can do a DNA test," she said softly, if that's what you want." Richard agreed, and over the next few weeks, as they waited for the results, he found himself in a state of limbo. He spent more time with Sophie and Daniel, getting to know them, but always with the question hanging over his head: was Sophie really his daughter? During this time, Richard also delved deeper into Emily's past. He spoke with old friends, colleagues, anyone who might have known her during that time. Slowly, a picture began to emerge of a woman struggling with expectations, both her own and those of others. One evening, as Richard was going through old photos, he came across something that made his heart stop. It was a picture of Emily, taken just a few months before Sophie was born. She was standing sideways, and there, barely noticeable, was the slight swell of her stomach. Richard's hands shook as he stared at the photo. How had he not noticed? How had he been so blind? When the DNA results finally came back, Richard, Sophie, and James met at Richard's apartment. The tension was palpable as they opened the envelope. Richard read the results, his heart pounding. He looked up, his eyes meeting Sophie's. "Gone. You're my daughter," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're really my daughter." The relief that washed over him was unexpected in its intensity. Despite everything, the lies, the betrayal, the years of not knowing, Richard felt a sense of rightness. Sophie was his daughter. Daniel was his grandson. He had a family. As the reality sank in, Richard turned to James. "I'm sorry," he said, surprising himself with the sincerity in his voice. "I know this must be difficult for you too." James nodded, his expression a mix of sadness and acceptance. "I always hoped she was yours," he admitted. "Emily loved you so much, Richard. Even if she made mistakes, even if she kept secrets, she loved you." In the days that followed, Richard found himself re-evaluating everything he thought he knew about his life with Emily. The love was still there, but it was tempered now with a new understanding of her complexities, her fears, her humanity. He also found himself growing closer to Sophie and Daniel. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of awkwardness, but there were also moments of joy, of connection, of family. One afternoon, as Richard watched Sophie playing with Daniel in the park, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. The pain of Emily's secrets was still there, but it was overshadowed now by the gift she had unknowingly given him, the chance to be a father, a grandfather, to have a family he thought he'd never have. As Daniel toddled over to him, arms outstretched, Richard scooped him up, feeling the weight of his grandson in his arms. He looked at Sophie, saw Emily in her smile, and felt, for the first time in years, that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy. There were still questions to be answered, wounds to be healed. But as Richard held Daniel close, with Sophie by his side, he knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, as a family. As the weeks turned into months, Richard found himself navigating a new reality. The initial shock of discovering Sophie and Daniel had given way to a cautious optimism, a desire to build something meaningful with the family he never knew he had. However, the path forward was far from smooth. One sunny afternoon, Richard met Sophie at a small cafe near Central Park. Daniel was with her, babbling happily in his stroller. As Richard approached, he felt a familiar warmth in his chest, a feeling he was still getting used to. "Hi," Sophie said, offering a small smile. "Thanks for meeting us." Richard nodded, taking a seat across from her. "Of course. How are you both doing?" "Oh, good," Sophie replied, glancing down at Daniel. "He's starting to say a few words now. Mostly mama and no," she added with a chuckle. Richard felt a pang of regret at missing these early milestones. "That's wonderful," he said, trying to keep his voice light. "I remember when you first told me about him. I could hardly believe I was a grandfather." Sophie's expression softened. "It's been a big adjustment for all of us," she acknowledged, "but I'm glad you want to be part of his life." As they talked, Richard found himself relaxing. It was still strange, this new dynamic, but it was becoming more natural with each interaction. They discussed Daniel's development, Sophie's work as a freelance graphic designer, and Richard's latest business ventures. But as their conversation progressed, Richard sensed there was something Sophie wanted to say. She seemed distracted, her eyes darting away whenever he tried to make eye contact. "Sophie," he said gently, "is everything all right? You seem preoccupied." Sophie took a deep breath, her hands fidgeting with her coffee cup. "Actually, there's something I wanted to talk to you about," she began. "It's about Daniel's father." Richard felt his heart rate quicken. In all their conversations, the topic of Daniel's father had never come up. He had assumed it was a sensitive subject and hadn't wanted to pry. "Okay," he said cautiously. "What about him?" Sophie's eyes met his, filled with a mix of determination and apprehension. "He's back in the picture," she said, "and he wants to be part of Daniel's life." Richard felt a surge of protectiveness he hadn't expected. "I see," he said, trying to keep his voice neutral. "And how do you feel about that?" "I'm conflicted," Sophie admitted. "Tom, that's his name, he left when I told him I was pregnant. Said he wasn't ready to be a father, but now he's back saying he's changed, that he wants to make things right." Richard nodded slowly, processing this new information. "And you're considering letting him be involved?" Sophie sighed. "I don't know. Part of me wants to give him a chance for Daniel's sake, but another part of me is scared of letting him in, of him disappointing Daniel like he disappointed me." Richard reached across the table, placing his hand over Sophie's. It was a gesture that surprised them both, but felt right in the moment. "Sophie, I can't tell you what to do, but I want you to know that whatever you decide, I'm here for you and Daniel." Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means more than you know." As they left the cafe, Richard's mind was whirling. The idea of another man entering Daniel's life, potentially taking on the role of father, stirred up complicated emotions. He had only just started to build a relationship with his grandson, and now he felt an irrational fear of being pushed aside. Over the next few weeks, Richard found himself spending even more time with Sophie and Daniel. He took them to the zoo, read bedtime stories over video calls, and even attempted to babysit Daniel for an afternoon, with mixed results involving a diaper change gone wrong and a very messy kitchen. But as he grew closer to them, Richard also noticed Sophie's increasing stress. Tom had been calling more frequently, pushing for visits with Daniel. Sophie was torn, wanting to do what was best for her son, but unsure of what that really meant. One evening, as Richard was leaving Sophie's apartment after dinner, he found himself face to face with a young man in the hallway. The man looked surprised to see him, his eyes darting between Richard and Sophie's door. "Can I help you?" Richard asked, his tone polite but wary. The man shifted uncomfortably. I'm here to see Sophie. And Daniel, I'm Tom." Richard felt a surge of emotions, anger, protectiveness, and a hint of fear. This was the man who had abandoned Sophie when she needed him most, and now he was here, threatening to disrupt the fragile family dynamic they had been building. "I see," Richard said, his voice cool. "Sophie didn't mention you were coming by." Tom had the grace to look embarrassed. She didn't know. I thought, if I just showed up, maybe she'd be more willing to talk." Richard's jaw clenched. He knew it wasn't his place to interfere, but he couldn't help feeling protective of Sophie and Daniel. "That's not a good idea," he said firmly. "Sophie needs time to think about what's best for Daniel. Showing up unannounced isn't going to help your case." Tom's expression hardened. "With all due respect, I don't know who you are or what your relationship is to Sophie and my son, but this is between us." "Your son?" Richard repeated, his voice rising slightly. "The son you walked away from before he was even born?" The tension in the hallway was palpable. Just as it seemed the situation might escalate, Sophie's door opened. She stood there, taking in the scene before her with wide eyes. "Tom," she said, her voice a mix of surprise and apprehension. "What are you doing here?" Tom's demeanor changed instantly, softening as he looked at Sophie. "I'm sorry for just showing up," he said. I really want to talk about Daniel, about us." Sophie glanced between Tom and Richard, her expression conflicted. Finally, she sighed. "Okay," she said. "We can talk, but not tonight. I'll call you tomorrow and we can set up a time." Tom nodded, looking relieved. He cast one last glance at Richard before turning to leave. As he walked away, Sophie turned to Richard, her eyes questioning. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Richard nodded, trying to calm the storm of emotions inside him. "I'm fine," he said. "I'm more worried about you." "Are you sure you want to talk to him?" Sophie leaned against the doorframe, suddenly looking very tired. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I think I have to. For Daniel's sake, if nothing else." Richard wanted to argue, to protect her from the potential hurt that Tom's reappearance could bring, but he knew it wasn't his decision to make. "Whatever you decide," he said, echoing his words from the cafe, "I'm here for you." Sophie smiled weakly. "I know," she said, "and that means everything." As Richard left the building and stepped out into the cool night air, he felt a mix of emotions he couldn't quite untangle. He was proud of Sophie for handling the situation with such grace, worried about the impact Tom's return might have on her and Daniel, and if he was honest with himself, a little afraid of what it might mean for his own place in their lives. But as he walked home, Richard realized something important. Regardless of what happened with Tom, regardless of the challenges that lay ahead, he was committed to being there for Sophie and Daniel. They were his family now, and he would do whatever it took to support and protect them. The road ahead might be uncertain, but Richard was determined to face it head-on, with Sophie and Daniel by his side. The following weeks brought a whirlwind of changes and heightened tensions. Sophie had agreed to meet with Tom, and their discussions about co-parenting Daniel had become increasingly frequent. Richard found himself grappling with a complex mix of emotions, concern for Sophie and Daniel's well-being, a growing sense of protectiveness, and an unexpected feeling of being threatened by Tom's presence in their lives. One particularly tense afternoon, Richard arrived at Sophie's apartment for their usual weekend visit, only to find Tom already there. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension as Richard entered the living room. "Richard," Sophie greeted him, her voice strained. "I hope you don't mind, Tom and I were just discussing Daniel's schedule." Richard nodded stiffly, his eyes meeting Tom's in a silent challenge. "Of course," he replied, trying to keep his tone neutral. "I can come back later if you'd prefer." No, Sophie insisted. "Please stay, we're almost done here." As Richard took a seat, he couldn't help but notice the way Tom seemed to position himself closer to Daniel, who was playing contentedly on the floor. The gesture, whether intentional or not, stirred something in Richard, a fierce desire to assert his own place in Daniel's life. Actually, Tom spoke up, his voice carrying a hint of defiance. "I was thinking of taking Daniel to the park this afternoon, just the two of us." Sophie hesitated, her eyes darting between Tom and Richard. "I don't know, Tom. We hadn't discussed solo outings yet." "Come on, Sophie," Tom pressed. "I'm his father. I should be able to spend time alone with him." Richard felt his jaw clench. Before he could stop himself, he interjected, "And what about Sophie's comfort? Daniel's safety? You can't just waltz back into their lives and expect everything to be handed to you on a silver platter." Tom's eyes flashed with anger. "Excuse me? Who exactly are you to make these decisions? You're not Daniel's father. You're not even Sophie's real father. You're just some guy who showed up out of nowhere, trying to play family. The room fell silent, the weight of Tom's words hanging heavily in the air. Sophie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. "Tom," she exclaimed, "that's completely out of line." Richard felt as if he'd been physically struck. The insecurity he'd been harboring, the fear that he didn't truly belong in Sophie and Daniel's lives came rushing to the surface. He stood up abruptly, his hands shaking with suppressed emotion. "I think it's best if I leave," he said, his voice low and controlled. "Richard, wait," Sophie pleaded, reaching out to him. But Richard was already heading for the door, needing to escape the suffocating tension of the apartment. As he stepped out into the hallway, he could hear Sophie's muffled voice, clearly upset, berating Tom for his outburst. But Richard couldn't bring himself to go back inside. Tom's words had hit too close to home, voicing the doubts that had been plaguing him since he first learned about Sophie's existence. Over the next few days, Richard found himself withdrawing from Sophie and Daniel. He missed their scheduled video calls, made excuses to postpone their usual meetups. The pain of Tom's words, combined with his own insecurities, had created a barrier he didn't know how to overcome. It was Sophie who finally broke through his self-imposed isolation. She showed up at his office unannounced, Daniel in tow, her expression a mix of concern and determination. "We need to talk," she said firmly, leaving no room for argument. Richard nodded, leading them into his private office. As soon as the door closed behind them, Sophie turned to face him. "What's going on, Richard?" she asked, her voice soft but insistent. "Why have you been avoiding us?" Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm sorry, Sophie. I needed some time to think." "About what Tom said?" Sophie pressed, her eyes searching his face. Richard nodded reluctantly. He wasn't entirely wrong, was he? "I'm not Daniel's father. I'm not even your father in any real sense. Maybe I've been fooling myself thinking I could be part of your lives." Sophie's expression softened. She stepped closer to Richard, shifting Daniel to her hip. "Richard, look at me," she said gently. "You are part of our lives. You're Daniel's grandfather, and you're the closest thing to a father I've ever known. Tom had no right to say what he did." Richard felt a lump forming in his throat. "But he's Daniel's father. He has a right to be in his life." "Yes, he does," Sophie agreed, "but that doesn't diminish your role. Family isn't just about blood, Richard. It's about love, commitment, being there for each other. And you've shown us more love and commitment in the short time we've known you than Tom has in Daniel's entire life." As if to emphasize his mother's words, Daniel reached out towards Richard, his little hands opening and closing in a clear request to be held. Richard hesitated for a moment before taking the boy into his arms. Daniel immediately snuggled against his chest, and Richard felt something inside him shift. "I'm sorry," he said softly, looking at Sophie over Daniel's head. "I shouldn't have pulled away. I was just scared, I guess. Scared of losing you both." Sophie smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You're not going to lose us, Richard. We're family now, all of us, including Tom, as complicated as that might be. We'll figure this out together." As they stood there in Richard's office, Daniel contentedly nestled in his arms. Richard felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead might be challenging, with Tom's presence adding an extra layer of complexity to their already unconventional family dynamic. But Sophie was right. They were family now, and they would face whatever came their way together. "So," Richard said, his voice stronger now, "what do we do about Tom?" Sophie sighed, her expression turning serious. "We need to set some boundaries. Clear, firm boundaries, and we need to make it clear that while he has a place in Daniel's life, he doesn't get to dictate the terms of our family relationships." Richard nodded, feeling a surge of pride at Sophie's determination. "We'll do it together," he said, "all of us, as a family." As they left the office, Richard holding Daniel and Sophie by his side, he felt a renewed sense of belonging. The doubts weren't entirely gone, but they were quieter now, overshadowed by the love he felt for his daughter and grandson. The challenges with Tom were far from over, but Richard was ready to face them head-on, because now he knew, without a doubt, that he had a place in this family, and he would do whatever it took to protect and nurture the precious relationships he had found. As we reach this pivotal moment in Richard, Sophie, and Daniel's journey, I can't help but wonder how you, our readers, might handle such a complex family situation. The delicate balance between Richard's newfound role as a grandfather, Sophie's desire to do what's best for Daniel, and Tom's reappearance creates a tapestry of emotions and challenges. What are your thoughts on Richard's initial reaction to withdraw? Have you ever faced a situation where you felt your place in someone's life was threatened? How did you overcome it? Your insights and experiences could shed light on the intricate dynamics at play here. Perhaps you've been in Sophie's position, trying to navigate co-parenting with a former partner while building a relationship with a new family member. Or maybe you relate to Richard's struggle to define his role in this unconventional family setup. I'm particularly curious about your views on how Richard, Sophie, and Tom should move forward. What boundaries do you think need to be set? How can they create a healthy environment for Daniel amidst these complex adult relationships? Your perspective could offer valuable insights not only for our characters but for others facing similar real-life situations. So if you feel compelled, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your comment could be the one that sparks a meaningful discussion and helps others navigate their own family complexities. Remember, every family story is unique and your voice matters in this conversation. Let's explore these themes of family, belonging, and reconciliation together. The following weeks were a delicate balancing act for Richard, Sophie, and Tom as they attempted to navigate their new thermigor. Richard, determined to maintain his place in Sophie and Daniel's lives, suggested they all meet with a family counselor to help establish clear boundaries and expectations. On a crisp autumn morning, they gathered in the counselor's office, the tension palpable as they took their seats. Dr. Amelia Foster, a seasoned family therapist, observed them with keen eyes. Let's start by discussing what each of you hopes to achieve from these sessions, Dr. Foster began. Sophie spoke first, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. I want us to find a way to co-parent Daniel that's healthy for him. I want him to have relationships with all of us, without feeling caught in the middle. Tom nodded, his expression a mix of determination and guilt. I want to be a good father to Daniel. I know I messed up before, but I'm committed to being there for him now. Richard took a deep breath before speaking. I want to continue being part of Sophie and Daniel's lives. I've come to love them both, and I want to support them however I can. As the session progressed, Dr. Foster guided them through difficult conversations about expectations, fears, and hopes. It became clear that, while they all wanted what was best for Daniel, their ideas of what that meant often clashed. Tom, Dr. Foster said, addressing a particularly tense moment, you mentioned feeling threatened by Richard's presence in Daniel's life. Can you elaborate on that? Tom shifted uncomfortably in his seat. It's just he's had more time with Daniel than I have. Sometimes I feel like I'm playing catch-up, like I'll never be as important to Daniel as Richard is. Richard felt a surge of empathy, recognizing his own fears mirrored in Tom's words. I understand that feeling, he said, surprising everyone, including himself. When you first came back into the picture, I was afraid of being pushed aside, of losing the connection I'd built with Daniel. The honesty in Richard's admission seemed to break through some of the tension. Sophie looked between the two men, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. You're both important to Daniel, she said softly, and to me. We don't have to compete. There's room for all of us in his life. Dr. Foster nodded approvingly. That's an excellent point, Sophie. Let's talk about how we can create that space for everyone without anyone feeling threatened or sidelined. Over the next hour, they worked together to establish guidelines for co-parenting. They agreed on a schedule for Daniel's time with Tom, with provisions for gradually increasing his solo time with his son. They also discussed how to handle holidays, birthdays, and other special occasions. Richard, feeling more secure in his role, suggested that he and Tom could occasionally spend time with Daniel together, allowing the boy to see that the adults in his life could get along. As the session drew to a close, Dr. Foster addressed them all. This is just the beginning of the journey. There will be challenges ahead, but if you continue to communicate openly and prioritize Daniel's well-being, I believe you can make this work. Leaving the counselor's office, Richard felt a mix of exhaustion and hope. It wouldn't be easy, but they had taken an important first step. Over the next few months, they put their agreement into practice. There were stumbles along the way, missed schedules, miscommunications, and moments of jealousy or resentment, but slowly, a new normal began to emerge. Richard found himself adapting to his role as grandfather, learning to step back when it was Tom's time with Daniel, but also cherishing the special moments he shared with his grandson. He and Sophie continued to grow closer, their bond strengthening as they navigated this complex situation together. One sunny afternoon, as Richard watched Tom pushing Daniel on the swings in the park, Sophie came to stand beside him. "Thank you," she said quietly. Richard turned to her, puzzled. "For what?" Sophie smiled, her eyes on her son's laughing face. "For being so understanding, for fighting for us, but also for being willing to share. I know it hasn't been easy." Richard put his arm around Sophie's shoulders, feeling a surge of affection. "You're right, it hasn't been easy, but you and Daniel are worth it. We're family, and that means facing challenges together." As they stood there, watching Tom and Daniel play, Richard reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The pain of Emily's secrets, The shock of discovering Sophie, the challenges of building a relationship with her and Daniel, and now the complex dance of co-parenting with Tom, it had all led to this moment. It wasn't perfect. There would still be difficult days ahead, but as Richard looked at his family, unconventional as it might be, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had been given a second chance at family, at love, at belonging, and he was determined to make the most of it. Later that evening, as Richard was preparing to leave Sophie's apartment after dinner, Tom arrived to pick up Daniel for their weekend together. There was a moment of awkwardness as the two men faced each other, but then Richard extended his hand. "Have a good weekend," he said sincerely. Tom hesitated for a moment before shaking Richard's hand. "Thanks," he replied. "I'll make sure to send you some pictures of whatever trouble this little guy gets into." Richard chuckled, ruffling Daniel's hair. "I look forward to it." As he walked home that night, Richard felt a sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead might still be uncertain, but he was no longer walking it alone. He had a family now, complicated, unconventional, and sometimes messy, but a family nonetheless. And for Richard Lawson, who had spent so many years feeling lost and alone, that was more than enough. As the seasons changed and Daniel grew, the unconventional family dynamic Richard, Sophie, and Tom had established began to solidify. However, just as they were finding their rhythm, a new challenge emerged that would test the strength of their fragile peace. One crisp autumn morning, Sophie called Richard, her voice tight with worry. "Richard, I need your help," she said without preamble. "I've been offered a job in San Francisco. It's an amazing opportunity, but..." Richard felt his heart skip a beat. But it would mean moving away. He finished for her, the implications already clear in his mind. "Yes," Sophie confirmed, "and I don't know what to do. This job could really advance my career, but I'm worried about uprooting Daniel, about how it would affect his relationship with you and Tom." Richard took a deep breath, forcing himself to think rationally despite the panic rising in his chest. "Have you talked to Tom about this yet?" "No," Sophie admitted. "I wanted to talk to you first. I'm afraid Tom might react badly." Richard nodded, even though Sophie couldn't see him. He understood her hesitation. The fragile balance they had achieved could easily be upset by such a significant change. "We should all sit down and discuss this together," Richard suggested, trying to keep his voice calm and supportive despite his own turmoil. "So this affects all of us, and Daniel's well-being should be our primary concern." Sophie agreed, and they set up a meeting for the following evening. As Richard hung up the phone, he felt a wave of emotions wash over him. The thought of Sophie and Daniel moving across the country filled him with dread. He had only just found them, and the idea of losing them now was almost unbearable. The next evening, Richard arrived at Sophie's apartment to find Tom already there, his face set in a grim expression. It was clear Sophie had already broached the subject with him. As they all sat down, the tension in the room was palpable. Sophie took a deep breath and began to explain the Jexter in detail, the opportunities it presented, the potential for growth, the benefits for her and Daniel. Tom listened with a frown, his arms crossed over his chest. When Sophie finished, he spoke, his voice tight with barely contained anger. "You can't just take my son away from me," he said. "We've only just started to build a relationship. If you move to San Francisco, how am I supposed to be part of his life?" Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "I'm not trying to take Daniel away from you, Tom. I'm just trying to do what's best for both of us. This job could provide so much for him." Richard watched the exchange, his heart heavy. He understood both perspectives, Sophie's desire to advance her career and provide for her son, and Tom's fear of losing the connection he'd only recently established with Daniel. "What if," Richard began cautiously, drawing both their attention, "we looked at this as an opportunity rather than a problem to solve?" Sophie and Tom both looked at him quizzically. "Sophie," Richard continued, "this job sounds like an incredible opportunity for you. And Tom, I know you're worried about maintaining your relationship with Daniel, but what if we use this as a chance to really commit to co-parenting, to making sure Daniel has strong relationships with all of us, regardless of distance?" He turned to Tom. "You mentioned wanting to be more involved in Daniel's life. What if you use this as an opportunity to do that? Maybe you could look for job opportunities in San Francisco too?" Tom's expression shifted from anger to surprise. "Move to San Francisco? I hadn't considered that." Sophie looked between them, hope dawning in her eyes. "That could work," she said softly. "We could look for places with good schools, maybe find somewhere with a guest room so Richard could visit often." Richard felt a lump form in his throat at Sophie's words, touched by her consideration. "And with technology these days," he added, "we could have regular video calls, send photos and videos. It wouldn't be the same as being in the same city, but we could make it work." Tom still looked uncertain but less hostile. I'd need to think about it, he said. Moving across the country is a big decision. Of course, Sophie nodded. I don't have to give them an answer right away. We have some time to figure this out. As the evening wore on, they continued to discuss the possibilities, the challenges, and the potential solutions. It wasn't an easy conversation, and there were moments of tension and disagreement. But underlying it all was a shared commitment to Daniel's well-being and a determination to make their unconventional family work. When Richard left that night, he felt a mix of emotions. The prospect of Sophie and Daniel moving away still filled him with sadness, but there was also a glimmer of hope. They had faced challenges before and come out stronger. Perhaps this, too, could be an opportunity for growth. Over the next few weeks, they continued to discuss the potential move. Tom started looking into job opportunities in San Francisco, and Richard researched the best ways to maintain long-distance relationships with grandchildren. One evening, as Richard was video chatting with Sophie and Daniel, he watched his grandson excitedly show off a new toy. Despite the pixelated image and the distance between them, Richard felt the familiar warmth of love and connection. You know, he said to Sophie, after Daniel had run off to play, I think we can make this work. It won't be easy, but we're family. Distance can't change that. Sophie smiled, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Thank you, Richard, for everything. I don't know what I'd do without you. As Richard ended the call, he realized something important. The family he had found might not look like what he had always imagined, and it certainly came with its share of challenges. But it was real, it was his, and he would do whatever it took to nurture and protect it. The future might be uncertain, with potential moves and changes on the horizon, but Richard felt ready to face it, because now he knew that no matter where life took them, the bonds they had forged were strong enough to withstand any distance. As the plans for the potential move to San Francisco began to take shape, Richard found himself grappling with a new set of emotions. The initial shock and fear had given way to a bittersweet mix of pride in Sophie's accomplishments and a deep-seated anxiety about the changes to come. One crisp autumn morning, Richard decided to visit Emily's grave. He hadn't been there in months, not since the day he first met Sophie. As he stood before the headstone, a bouquet of lilies in his hand, he felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Oh, Emily, he sighed, placing the flowers gently on the grave. I wish you could see her now. Our daughter, she's incredible. And Daniel, he's growing so fast. You'd be proud of them both. Richard paused, collecting his thoughts. I'm trying to do right by them, to be the father and grandfather they deserve, but it's not always easy. Sometimes I wonder what you would do in my place. As he stood there, lost in thought, he heard footsteps approaching. Turning, he was surprised to see James, his old friend and Emily's former lover, walking towards him. Richard, James said, looking equally surprised. I didn't expect to see you here. Richard nodded stiffly, still unsure how to feel about James's role in Emily's past. James, it's been a while. An awkward silence fell between them, both men acutely aware of the complicated history that bound them together. Finally, James spoke. How are Sophie and Daniel? I've been thinking about them a lot lately. Richard raised an eyebrow. Have you? I didn't realize you were still keeping tabs on them. James had the grace to look embarrassed. I'm not really. It's just I feel responsible in a way. If I had pushed Emily harder to tell you the truth back then, things might have been different. Richard sighed, feeling the weight of the past pressing down on him. Maybe, or maybe not. We can't change what happened, James. We can only move forward. James nodded, his eyes on Emily's grave. You're right, of course, and how is that going? Moving forward. Richard hesitated for a moment before deciding to open up. It's complicated. Sophie's been offered a job in San Francisco. She's considering moving there with Daniel. James's eyes widened. That's a big change. How do you feel about it? Honestly, I'm terrified, Richard admitted. I've only just found them, and now they might be moving across the country. But I'm trying to be supportive. It's a great opportunity for Sophie. James was quiet for a moment, considering Richard's words. You know, he said finally, Emily would be proud of you for putting Sophie and Daniel first, even when it's hard. Richard felt a lump form in his throat. Despite everything, James's words touched something deep within him. Thank you, he said softly. That means a lot. As they stood there, two men bound by love for the same woman and the daughter she left behind, Richard felt something shift. The anger and resentment he had harbored towards James began to fade, replaced by a sense of shared experience and understanding. James, Richard said, breaking the silence, I know things have been strained between us, but I think it's time we put the past behind us, for Sophie's sake and for Daniel's. James looked at Richard, surprise and hope mingling in his expression. I'd like that, he said sincerely, and if there's anything I can do to help with the potential move or anything else, please let me know. Richard nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. Actually, he said, an idea forming. There might be something you can do. Over the next few weeks, with James's help, Richard threw himself into preparations for Sophie and Daniel's potential move. He researched neighborhoods in San Francisco, looked into the best schools, and even reached out to some of his business contacts in the area to help Tom explore job opportunities. One evening, as Richard was video chatting with Sophie, she noticed the dark circles under his eyes. "Richard," she said, concern evident in her voice, "are you okay? You look exhausted." Richard smiled reassuringly. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just been busy with some projects." Sophie's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "What kind of projects?" Richard hesitated for a moment before deciding to come clean. "Well, I've been doing some research on San Francisco, schools, neighborhoods, that sort of thing. And I've been talking to some contacts out there who might be able to help Tom find a job." Sophie's eyes widened in surprise. "Richard, you didn't have to do all that. We haven't even decided for sure if we're moving yet." "I know," Richard said softly, "but I wanted to. If you do decide to go, I want to make sure you and Daniel have the best possible start there." Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes. "I don't know what to say. Thank you doesn't seem like enough. Richard felt his own eyes growing misty. "You don't have to say anything. You and Daniel, you're my family. I'd do anything for you." As they continued to talk, Richard felt a sense of peace settle over him. The prospect of Sophie and Daniel moving was still daunting, but he was beginning to see it as an adventure rather than a loss. He was part of their lives now, truly and deeply, and no amount of distance could change that. Later that night, as Richard lay in bed, he found himself thinking about Emily. He wondered what she would think of all this, of the family they had become, of the challenges they were facing together. "We're doing okay, Emily," he whispered into the darkness. "It's not always easy, but we're figuring it out. I think you'd be proud of us." And as he drifted off to sleep, Richard felt a sense of contentment wash over him. Whatever the future held, he knew they would face it together, as a family. In the tapestry of life, we often find ourselves entangled in threads of regret, betrayal, and missed opportunities. Richard's journey reminds us that it's never too late to weave a new pattern of love, forgiveness, and redemption. The path to healing isn't always straight or easy. It's riddled with the thorns of past mistakes and the weight of unspoken truths. But as Richard, Sophie, and even Tom have shown us, the first step towards redemption is acknowledging our faults and taking responsibility for our actions. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting the past, it's about choosing not to let it dictate our future. When Richard chose to embrace Sophie and Daniel, despite the years of secrets and absence, he opened a door to a new chapter of love and connection. His willingness to forgive Emily, to understand her fears and motivations, allowed him to reclaim a part of his life he thought was lost forever. But forgiveness isn't just about grand gestures. It's in the small moments too, in Richard's efforts to include Tom, in Sophie's patience as they navigate their new relationship, in Tom's commitment to being present for Daniel despite the challenges. Each of these actions is a stitch in the fabric of healing, slowly but surely mending the tears of the past. Remember, it's okay to feel hurt, to struggle with forgiveness. These emotions make us human, but holding on to anger and resentment only imprisons our own hearts. True freedom comes when we choose to release the burden of past wrongs and open up ourselves to the possibility of new beginnings. As you reflect on your own life, consider, what grudges are you holding on to? What relationships might be healed if you took that first, difficult step towards forgiveness? What parts of yourself are you struggling to forgive? Like Richard, you have the power to rewrite your story. It may not erase the past, but it can certainly brighten your future. Embrace the journey of forgiveness, not just for others, but for yourself too. For in the end, it's not about forgetting, but about growing, healing, and finding the strength to love again. As we reach the end of this emotional journey with Richard, Sophie, and their unconventional family, I can't help but wonder about your own experiences with forgiveness and redemption. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to forgive someone for keeping a life-changing secret? Or perhaps you've been the one seeking forgiveness for past mistakes? Your stories and insights could be incredibly valuable to others who might be struggling with similar situations. So, if you feel comfortable, why not share your thoughts in the comments below? Your words might just be the encouragement someone else needs to take that first step towards healing and forgiveness. And if you found Richard's story touching and thought-provoking, why not subscribe to our channel? By doing so, you'll ensure you never miss out on more compelling narratives that explore the complexities of human relationships, family dynamics, and personal growth. Remember, every subscription helps us continue to bring you these powerful stories that remind us of our shared humanity. Plus, as a subscriber, you'll be part of a community of thoughtful individuals who are passionate about exploring life's big questions through storytelling. So go ahead, leave a comment, share your story, and hit that subscribe button. Let's continue this journey of understanding and empathy together. Who knows? The next story might be one that speaks directly to your heart.